Welcome back to the Mental Dietitian Podcast. I'm your host, Ahren Lynch-Potter, and I'm really excited about this episode. It's a very unique episode with a very unique woman, Nicole Vilaca. I'm really excited to have you on the podcast. What does she do? She is, as she described, which is really cool, a global citizen strategist. So she helps people move, invest, learn about visas, passports, investing, buying properties, all kinds of stuff, and basically relocating potentially if you want to in this world that as we are more connected, people like even me, I wanted to have a podcast on this podcast for a reason, is I don't like the weather in Canada in winter. And there's a part of me that would love to create a life somewhere else, but it can be very scary, very hard to know which direction to go in. So I'm really excited to have you on the podcast today. Welcome. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very excited to dive in today, I think, especially with the timing of the month, but even
Yeah.
just years that we're in general, I think these topics are very prevalent.
100%. Like, tell us about, I know that you originally are from Canada, just outside of Toronto, and I know that I think you first started your journey by moving to China. Is that correct?
Yes, so I will sum up the journey because it's very long and it was about 8 years ago, so almost a decade ago that I left Canada. And really at that time, not knowing why I was leaving or what I wanted to do, but just knowing that it was not the place for me forever. I did all of the things that you're supposed to do. Probably you and most of the listeners listening have gone through the process of doing the university degree, getting the 9 to 5 job, and then you're on the track for what we're supposed to want, which is having a mortgage, car payment, the 2.5 kids, the 1 or 2 vacations per year. And I was 21 years old and I started looking, I was only working in corporate for about 6 months. I started looking at what the rest of my life was going to look like and not really being too fulfilled. You know, the university promise that we're all sold was not really everything that it was cut out to being at that point in my life. So at 21, I started looking at options of how I could leave. Fastest option ended up moving to China. That was a short-term plan. You know, my worst case scenario was I don't like China, it doesn't work out, go back to Canada, regroup, and then I move somewhere else and figure it out from there. And it's like, is that really the worst case scenario? It's not. So I moved to China, ended up loving it, lived in Shenzhen right across the border from Hong Kong for 4 years. And in the middle of that was 2020. And so the end of 2019, we started hearing, rumors of things happening in the north of China, people being hospitalized, went for Chinese New Year in January of 2020. And then most of Asia started having outbreaks. And so we were traveling throughout Asia, went back to Canada, got locked out of China. It's a long story, but that is really where the entrepreneurship journey started for me. Whereas previous to that, my plan was really to continue working in China, get higher degree certification, and work there for the rest of my life. And so I think for a lot of us and for myself as well, 2020 really derailed that in the best way possible, even though I was locked out of the country that I called home. And yeah, the journey really started from there.
Wow. What a crazy like people are, how did you start your business? It's just such a crazy way that life was like you're not supposed to stay in China and work up in the corporate world here. You're not like you did that in Canada, you didn't like it, don't do it here, and then life's all of a sudden like we're gonna force it and then super cool. So how much time did you spend back in Canada and what was your thought process when you were back in Canada? Because Canada at that time was also kind of wild. It was very unsure about what to do. When did you leave Canada?
For to go back to China the second time
Oh,
during
you went
COVID.
back you went back during COVID to China?
Yeah, so I actually, thankfully, not everyone was able to get back in, but I was able to through my employer in China. And so in October of 2020, after being in Canada for about 8 or 9 months, I went back to China, had to do 2 week quarantine. They would do blood tests. We were in the hotel for 2 weeks. It was very intense and interesting experience. But after that, I got back into China. And so I ended up living there for about another year quit my job about halfway in, and then they started just completely evicting all of the foreigners who were not illegally there, but just weren't really employed there. But at that time, I was ready to leave China and ready to see what else was out there in the business that I had started growing during COVID and during my second time back in China. But originally, I went to China, that was in 2017. And like I said, worst case scenario was I go back to Canada and I regroup, but I really loved it. So then we left China. I met my partner in China, and then we left China in 2021.
And what was the business when you said you started a business, what did it start out as? What were you doing?
But it actually started out during 2020 as e-commerce, which I quickly realized was something that was not at all my area of expertise. And I think for a lot of entrepreneurs, especially in the online space, you really have to try a few different things to figure out where your expertise fits. But also, if you're doing something day in and day out, and especially if you're doing it online, you're probably doing it more than 9 to 5 work hours for the most part. It has to be something that you really enjoy and that you're passionate about. And so ecom was great, realized that it was not for me, although 2020, especially having access to China and being in the West, was an interesting time for that. We left China, and that was when I really, because in China, I was a resident of China. So that was pretty simple in terms of taxation between Canada and China. But once we started traveling and living what I now call a global citizen life, but some may call it a digital nomad life, or just kind of working and traveling as you see fit, I realized that I had to work out the struggles of where my residence was, where I was paying taxes, where I was banking, which that's a whole nother piece of the puzzle that usually I find clients think about last, but really needs to be thought about before you get anything underway, because banking solutions aren't always the easiest, especially in 2024. But I had to figure it all out for myself. And so working with experts on the ground, and then we started helping clients. And now we work in 20 plus countries around the globe. We have teams in each country, lawyers, accountants, real estate teams, and we help global clients, but we have a lot of clients from Canada, from the US, from Australia, from New Zealand who are looking to leave. And it's not always full time. Sometimes they want to leave part time, or sometimes they don't want to leave at all, but they just want a diversification option if anything were to really push them over the edge in their home country.
Oh, this is a good one. There's a lot of people I know that are talking about, they're like looking at the state of Canada, just economically, socially. There's just a lot of interesting things happening here that want like I talk about all the time. There's a part of me that would like I would love to go and live in somewhere in Central America where as long as I have an internet connection and as long as I have within 3 hour time frame, like a time zone, should I say, I can do what I do now. I can sell cars over the phone. I can coach people. You said people think about the bank account last. Why is that the biggest hang up? Why is that such a difficult thing?
Yeah, so it depends where you're coming from and where you're going to. But let's say you're coming from a country like Canada, so you become a non-resident. So yes, you can still have your banking and your credit open. And it's a case by case, but we usually recommend, especially keeping your credit history active. But once you're a non-resident, you're not going to be relying on those accounts in the same way that you would if you're a resident. So then you get into a new country system, or potentially multiple country system, depending on what you're seeking. And some of the countries, especially in Latin America, actually, I'll say most of the countries in Latin America don't have a strong, reliable banking system. And so you're leaving Canada, which is a very reliable banking loan system, and you're going into a country, let's say, I'm going to use a very terrible example, but just for extreme examples, like Guatemala, you're getting into a country like Guatemala's banking system. Okay, that's fine if you're looking to do day-to-day small transactions and hold maybe $10,000, 20,000. Okay. But if you're looking to transfer all of your investments and all of your life savings and everything out of the country that you're a non-resident of, you really have to figure out where is your banking going to serve you best. And it doesn't have to be where your banking is in the same country as your residency, but you really have to structure that well. And then on the corporate side, you also have to structure where is your business and where are your clients paying you to? Because our clients from Canada and the US going to want to pay you and feel comfortable paying you into a Dubai free zone company or into a Turkish corporate bank account, right? So there's a lot of moving pieces and it looks different for every client based on their lifestyle. And that's a big component of it as well, is whenever we speak with clients, the first question we always ask is, what is your lifestyle and where do you want to live? What do you see your lifestyle being in the medium to long term? And then plan around that.
That perspective right there, if people, taking it out of the context of moving countries, if people were taught at a young age, what kind of life do you want to live? Not what do you want to do, but like what do you want your life to look like? When you wake up in the morning, when do you want to start work? How much money do you want to make? And how much is that money that you make, what's it going to do? You wouldn't have people spending 8, 12 years in school becoming a dentist and all of a sudden realizing they also want to be parents at the same time, and then all their clients are at nighttime and they don't see their kids and they're like, oh shit. Like that right there is so powerful. Like, what do you want your life to look like? And it sounds like that's kind of why you're here. You were started off in the corporate world and now you're helping other people shift that. Yeah, it's really, really cool.
Totally is. And I actually didn't coin this at all, but I didn't realize that Tim Ferriss coined it. Somebody told me that. But I just kind of intuitively called it lifestyle design. And it's really just, I'm really big, of course, in what I do, but just in life in general, in critically thinking and analyzing every piece of information that comes to you, especially from governments. I think a lot of those, especially when you're living in your home country and that's all you know, there's no critical thinking really going on there. But I'm a big proponent of critical thinking and critically thinking about what do you want your life to look like in the short, medium, long term? What are those goals and how are you going to get there?
Yeah, like people don't think about that. It's very interesting that people don't critically think when they're in a country that they grew up with. I imagine there's this saying that I love, and it says the last animal to know the existence of water is a fish. And the only way a fish knows it's in water is if you remove the fish from the water. And it sounds like your journey was a lot of that, like going to different countries and you're this Canadian fish getting put in a Guatemalan water and then or Argentinian water or Chilean water or from Paraguay or China, and you're like, oh, this is different. I can actually do this and I can actually help other people. Yeah, like what's the biggest challenge to people moving to different countries, say South America? Because most people, if they're in North America, they're probably going to move to somewhere like maybe Mexico, maybe Belize, like that whole Central American part, and maybe they'll even go further south. Like, what is the biggest thing that you see, or the biggest fear that holds people back from really taking that step?
So there's a few different buckets of this, quite honestly. Of course, there's the bucket of what I do, which is the very logical aspect of how are you going to be able to legally reside in the country, bank, maybe work your way towards citizenship. But then there's also the emotional aspect as well, and the practical aspect. And in the emotional aspect, I see a lot of younger clients that come to us, and not always, but in some cases, they're very worried about what their family, their friends, everything that they have ever known in their life, what they are going to think about them and the judgment that may or may not be passed on them. And I find it interesting because I come from a family that's really supportive of anything that I want to do, whether it's travel the world like we do or stay in Canada forever. Like it doesn't really matter as long as I'm happy. But it's also a reality that many families are not like that. And so we've definitely had clients and even podcast guests. I was just on a podcast where we were diving into the host family was not supportive initially of their journey because we're so brainwashed into thinking that you're supposed to take these certain steps. You get a degree, you're a teacher, you're a dentist, whatever. And that's what you are for the rest of your life. So I think it's a lot of unlearning sometimes on the family and the friends part, or it's also a difficulty, but I call it a positive reality of losing connections over time. Like I have lost touch with many of my more so friends, not so much family. They're always in the background, but friends who, when I was in Canada and it was more of a convenient relationship, then we were great friends. But now that I am almost never in Canada and I'm traveling the world full time, the relationship just isn't there. So I think that is, I mean, I see that as a positive because that's to me not a true friendship, but it can be a difficult reality for a lot of people to swallow. But you will make new friends, new connections. And really, what I like about traveling is meeting like-minded individuals, not just meeting those out of convenience. And then one other thing I will say, and I think this is very obvious, but one thing that I will say that's also a difficulty is, especially in Latin America, is English is not widely spoken. And when I was in Asia, when I was in Europe, English, it is so much easier to get around speaking English because all of the countries speak a different language. So the common language is English. Whereas in Central and South America, all of the countries except Brazil speak Spanish. And even in Brazil, it's more common to hear Spanish, Portuguese, vice versa in the Latin American countries than it is to hear English. So that is one of the struggles that I think a lot of expats, especially when you think Americans going to Mexico, it's like, actually, Mexico is definitely the best for English.
Yeah.
But you think,
Yeah.
oh, it's going to be easy, it's fine, they all speak English. Especially if you're leaving Mexico, that's not going to be the case.
The language barriers are obviously very obvious. I mean, I work in the space where I coach people who are going through mostly psychedelic therapies, right? That's what I do outside of selling cars. Very different. The biggest thing, if I could generalize it, the biggest thing that people have a hard time with is letting go of things that they identify with. So if you identify as I'm a Canadian, I'm 24, I'm from Brampton, Ontario, or I'm from Waterloo, or wherever people are from, or I'm from Vancouver, it's like that's all a construct in your mind. It's made up. And then when you meet somebody like Nicole, it's like, hey, you can actually be whatever you want. And it's this weird kind of stepping into a freedom that some people, like, we're not logical. I'm sure you've had so many clients that are like, all the logical things are there, and they're just like, no, can't do it because their mum was like, don't do that, honey. And then they never proceed, and and this dream that they said they wanted never happens. And they wanted to live in Chile and they wanted to surf every day on the beach and be on their laptop. Never happens because mum said, why don't you go do your degree in psychology at the university in Ottawa? And you're like, I think that's the biggest thing that I can imagine that keeps people stuck because we're not logical. We're emotional. We're deeply emotional creatures. So,
And
yeah.
it's interesting you bring that up. I completely agree with that. And I was actually just speaking to somebody, another foreigner who I've met here in the city that we're in the other week. And he asked me, and I knew exactly what he was getting at because I see it all the time. But I think a lot of us don't really critically think about this. It's like when you tell me who you are, what do you start with?
Oh, yeah.
You know exactly where this is going to. And it's always you are your job, you are your profession, you're defined by what you do. And that is, I would say, 9 times out of 10, if you're not aware of it, that is something that we just automatically define ourselves as. It's not as I'm a creative individual, I'm X, Y, and Z. It's I am my job, my work. And so I think that really goes a lot to what you just said as well. And again, really thinking critically about these things and understanding that you are multifaceted.
You can do whatever you want. And what happens when that job ends? Are you not Nicole anymore? Like if all of a sudden you switched gears and you weren't helping people become global citizens and you were doing something completely different. You're a dive instructor, and I'm a dive instructor now. Like, does all of a sudden is Nicole dead? Like, are you not you anymore? It's like, yeah, people have a really hard time, and the more you can identify with your character and the internal things rather than external things, you have a much easier life and you have freedom. That's what you're describing is you're helping people create freedom from certain identities they have around what country that they were born in or what life they're supposed to live. And we live in a world where you can do that easier than any other time in history. But it also is scary. I have these stories that I tell myself if I wanted to step into that way of living, Well, one very obvious one is I have three cats, so it wouldn't really work. Like it wouldn't work right now because we'd have to either give up the cats or migrate the cats somewhere, and that would be annoying. But a lot of people have these little stories that they probably just stack up of reasons of why they can't go after what they want. Yeah, is half of your, I wouldn't say half of your job, is a lot of your job just like soothing people's fears about what could go wrong?
Honestly, it's not. I mean, I've lived this for almost a decade. So when clients come to us with any fears or hesitations or just lifestyle questions, most of the time it's something that I have faced
Yeah,
or that we've had clients who have faced it and we've solved it on their behalf. But quite honestly, most of the clients who come to us are ready and are ready to make the move. And we actually just had a client the other day, great example of a client who, like many of our clients, so he's like, we sold the house, we don't have pets, I have to leave the country, my visa expires in 4 days, and so we're now going to this country, and it's like, okay, we'll be there in 4 days, we'll see you there, and we need your FBI check, we're going to get things started, like we really can get the ball rolling, but it depends on your time frame. So most of our clients are pretty well accustomed to the mindset of like, I'm going to be traveling or I'm going to be living elsewhere for long term. Thankfully, most of our clients are not just kind of on the fence,
yeah,
but I mean, that's why we have consult calls for the strategy, but also for if you're really just wondering how this lifestyle could potentially work for you and if it even could work for you and if you would want it to work for you.
yeah, yeah. Here's a good question that people are going to want to know. What would you say the top three countries are for people to move to lifestyle wise? Um, how far their dollar goes. That's a big one people focus on. Everything's so freaking expensive these days in North America, from healthcare to groceries to gas. Like, what's the best quality of life that you've seen, or yeah, what's the top three? No particular order. It doesn't have to be number one, like, oh, this is the best, but like top three that come to mind.
Good question. I will preface that, and on a lifestyle perspective, everybody wants something different.
Yeah.
So definitely take here what I say here with a grain of salt because I'm not a beach person. I'm not a hot heat humidity person. So that rules out most of Latin America most of the year for me, even though I deal with it. But so it really depends on your lifestyle. Like I said, we do a lot of work in Latin America because it's an emerging market with a lot of opportunities. Europe, especially Western Europe, I mean, there are still interesting opportunities in certain parts of Europe, but in terms of residencies, tax optimizations, even banking, it's becoming a lot more difficult in places like Europe. Or same amount of difficulty, just a higher price point. You're looking at probably about 500,000 to 1 million to get into a program in Europe. And then Asia's always been pretty limited in terms of the programs that they have. So we do a lot of work in Latin America. And if you like the lifestyle, if you're open to learning some Spanish, then the jurisdictions that we usually see a lot of clients interested in, we do a lot of work in are Panama because it's a territorial tax system. It has great, I mean, it's the market in Latin America for banking and investments. If you're looking to have an offshore bank account, I mean, in Latin America and Europe, you have options. In Asia, there's some options, but in Latin America, most of the markets here just don't make any sense for banking, let alone investments. So Panama is one of them. Paraguay is another one that actually is quite interesting for a lot of clients. I'm in Paraguay right now. I've been here for a while because there's a lot of opportunity in the real estate market as well. But just in terms of it also being a territorial tax system here and it being very affordable, a lot of people love how affordable it is. And I personally really like the fact that I mean, the cities are not huge by any means, but it's a big enough city, but you also get the local factor. For me, what's important is in terms of food. So they have a lot of local beef that's not factory farmed. They have fresh veggies, fresh fruits. And really, those are the only things I eat. And I try to support local as much as possible here in Paraguay without, I mean, there's only one big supermarket chain, but without having to run to the supermarket all the time. And so that's what I really like about the country and coming here is I know that I can eat meat and it's grown well. It's grown in the country. It's grown with cows that are roaming the fields, which I mean, before a few months ago, I didn't eat meat for 10 or 15 years. I don't know. I lost
Oh,
track
wow.
around that amount of time. But that was because I was traveling and I was in countries like China, like Canada, where I didn't really know what was in a lot of the meat. Not that I'm a scientist knowing what's in all the meat now, but I
Yeah.
trusted a lot Paraguay. So that's one thing that I like and a lot of clients like about Paraguay. It's just a very low key lifestyle. And then there's other destinations. So there's Costa Rica, there's Mexico that a lot of clients like from the lifestyle perspective. Definitely some residency and tax optimization there. And then a lot of people, I did not, but a lot of people like Colombia actually because it has the mountains, it has big cities, it has beautiful beaches. So a lot of clients like Colombia.
Yeah, I don't hear about people talking about Paraguay very often. I don't know much about it. I just know it's quite a small country. It's obviously near Brazil, borders Brazil. Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people I hear is Costa Rica. That seems to be like the cool place to go. But I've watched lots of videos about it. Apparently, it's getting quite expensive, and it's like really being driven up in price. And I even looked. I went to the point where I was looking at rent per month, and I was like, "Holy shit, that's expensive! Like it's just as expensive as I pay here." But it was in US dollars, so it was more expensive. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the markets, especially when you're looking at real estate here, are in USD. It just makes more sense than the local
Oh,
currencies.
yeah,
But
yeah.
Costa Rica is probably one of the top, if not the top country in, well, they're in Central America, but within Central Latin America, that is very expensive, very popular for foreigners. A lot of Canadians and Americans, for the most part, are going to Costa Rica and they know it. And so the prices do reflect that. Certain areas of Panama are similar. Mexico, I actually just spent 6 months in Mexico and getting quite pricey, especially in the major cities, which of course is where foreigners want to be, but prices are increasing in Mexico by quite a bit. So it's interesting. I see a lot of foreigners wanting to relocate further south to South America. But I will say, and I think in a lot of our minds, I just had a client who was like, okay, I'm ready to go to Panama. Sorry, Paraguay. And then he looked at a map and he was like, oh, I mean, it took me from Canada the other month. I flew from Canada. It took me 10 hours with a 1 hour layover in Brazil. So it's pretty lengthy of a flight. And I think a lot of people don't realize that it's just a lot quicker, like go to Spain or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So that's also a consideration to take in mind if you're wanting to really relocate and expect family and friends to visit you.
Mm. Yeah, very interesting. What is the easiest, cheapest way for somebody who maybe doesn't have $500,000 or $1 million to relocate to Europe or some of these places? What is the easiest country you think to go live a life at outside of Canada or the US?
Yeah, well, I will say, Europe is quite pricey for certain programs, but in Latin America, I mean, the lowest price you're looking at a few $1,000s to $10,000, $20,000, which is still really affordable when you're looking to relocate somewhere. And with that, potentially, it depends on your lifestyle, but potentially work your way towards citizenship in time through naturalization. So really affordable when you compare it to quite a few other countries' programs in Europe. But that being said, I will say, and like we're a big proponent on I mean, we talk about it a lot on YouTube, but that these programs are always changing, getting reiterated by the government, if not every year, usually every 2 to 3 years, and prices increase, minimums increase. A great example is back in 2021 and before, to get residency in Panama, you did a $5,000 bank deposit, company, few other small things, residency done. Now you're looking at, I mean, it's about 20,000 to invest at the lowest price point, but if you want to purchase real estate, you're looking at 300,000. So that's a pretty big difference from $5,000 in your own bank account. Like that's still your own money.
Yeah.
So I mean, there have been significant changes in many other programs in South America, but that's just a good illustration of I feel like a lot of the time people think I'm trying to fear monger or something, and it's not fear mongering. It's really just the reality of governments see immigration into these countries. They know what's happening in Western countries, and they know that a lot of foreigners want to relocate or want a backup option. And so they're raising prices to accommodate to have the more well-off individuals in their society. So that is definitely a point that I always like to make very clear, like what's on the table now may not be on the table in 6 months or 1 year from now. But I mean, if you're looking to live, I don't want to say the lowest cost of life, but a good life in Latin America, you have so many options. You have so many options. I personally found Colombia and Peru to be the most affordable. Paraguay is quite affordable. I found Colombia was just like they're just giving away everything. But for myself, I really liked Peru. But that just comes down to a lifestyle decision. I'm not a beach person, but Peru is right on the water. It has a great climate for certain parts of the year. It's a lot of seafood, which to me, I really like having fresh seafood. And the country has everything. It has a rainforest, it has Machu Picchu, it has incredible history, it has big cities, it has deserts. We went to an oasis in the desert. Like it just really does have everything. So for me, that's what I enjoy. But a lot of clients like Colombia, a lot like Brazil. Now, Brazil for taxes is quite tricky, but it's a great lifestyle destination. Or if you're looking to spend part of the year there, a lot of people like Paraguay for a backup option in terms of buying a second or third home. And if anything were to ever go wrong, like we're thinking worst case scenario, war breaks out. I mean, in Paraguay, like, yes, we are surrounded by Brazil and Argentina, but it's still a pretty remote location when you're
Oh,
comparing it
yeah.
to most countries in the world.
Yeah, like China's, if the China or Russia, they're not going to worry about Paraguay. Let's be honest. They don't, if there's a global world war, like Paraguay is probably pretty safe. Yeah, it's just a little country. Is it landlocked or is it on the, it is landlocked, right? Yeah, yeah.
It's not tiny, but it is a small enough country where you can go to Argentina and then you have the ocean. You can go to Brazil and you have the ocean and the sea. So you definitely have options in terms of just a quick, like 2 hour flight.
Very cool. Yeah, there's so much to think about, so much to ponder. Yeah, like, yeah, it depends what somebody wants. I imagine my life, what I want to create is I want to create a place where I can go and work for 3 or 4 months because I feel like having sunny weather by a beach. I like beaches. I grew up in Australia. I grew up in that. It's just like I want to create that. It's just figuring out where. Yeah. A lot of people want that and they're trying to work towards. I know people that talk about it all the time, but not a lot of people actually pull the trigger on it. I've noticed. Like it's just a lot of things that people talk about. What do you, where do you see yourself going next? Like you're in Paraguay right now. What's your plans over the next couple of months? Where do you think you'll be?
So I will say that I started this travel journey about 4 or 5 years ago, and before that, living an expat life. And when we first started traveling, we would be my partner and I every week. It would be a new Airbnb, new hotel, like go, go, go. We were in Europe and it was fun. It was great. After 1 or 2 years, got pretty tiring. So then we went to a month of traveling and like, Airbnb every month. You have a kitchen, which is really nice, a little bit more like home. And now we're kind of at a point where after doing this for so long, and this really being the long-term lifestyle, I mean, we'll definitely purchase, and that's a good part of being in Latin America is you can just kind of hop around to see different markets. We'll definitely purchase some places in a few different markets in Latin America, but we really like to take it a little bit slower
Yeah.
for now. So, we're Airbnb-ing, we're doing a lot with real estate. So sometimes we'll stay in our properties, sometimes we'll rent them out and whatnot. But it's nice to every 2 to 3 months instead of every couple of weeks or every 1 month to have to pack up everything you own and leave. So I guess I mean, it's funny because I'm pretty type A when it comes to business, but in terms of lifestyle, like I can be quite last minute and it's like, where are we sleeping in 2 nights? Like, we don't know. We'll figure it out. Like we'll always figure it out. And so I'm not really worried about what it looks like for the short term, but, I think we'll stay in Paraguay for a while. Like I said, there's a lot of opportunities here. So at least a couple months. And then from there, we'll figure it out in a couple months. But I think Paraguay, like we do. So I have a couple different residencies. So does my partner. So we have a few, not bases of homes in those countries. Is not necessarily countries that I would want to invest in just because I have residency there, but they are places that we like to go back to. And it's nice to go back to an area that you know. Like
Yeah.
you understand this country, this city, this specific neighborhood, this barrio in the city, and you know where the supermarkets are. You know who your friends are, where the cinema is. Like you just know the area. And so I feel like after traveling for 4 or 5 years, that was one of the things where we were like, okay, it's nice to know an area.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, there's something about the feeling of home. Like there's like the word home. Like it's like if you're constantly traveling, it's like you don't have a location that's a home. Home becomes like its internal feeling in a way. It's like, oh, I'm home. But like as it is nice to have places that you could have like a base at. So I imagine that you might even have several houses in the next few years that you're like, oh, this is my home here, and this is my home here, and this is my home here. Yeah, like where do you see yourself long term? Like what's your dream long term? Like 10 years from now, do you see yourself having homes all over the world? Like what do you see?
Yeah, I will say quickly on that point, traveling, and I've heard other travelers say this too, which I find funny, but home really becomes, I mean, in our case, it becomes a person. Like my partner is home. Like it doesn't matter the Airbnb or the hotel, it doesn't matter the city, like the person is home. And then of course, like he's from Mexico, I'm from Canada, so we go like home to see our families, but the actual place is not really home. It really becomes the people. So I just wanted to note that as well. And I think that's interesting living this lifestyle in the longer term. We'll always spend time in Latin America. I love Asia. Like I always say, Asia is my place. We spent so many years in China traveling throughout Asia. I love the culture. It's so unique. It's so different from anywhere else that you can find in the world. Love Asia in terms of investment, not the place where we really want to be. So I think we'll always be between Latin America and either Asia or Europe. But there are definitely, I mean, like we lived in Turkey for a year and we loved Turkey. So I could see us being there a little bit longer term, maybe being in Peru longer term, Paraguay longer term. And yeah, just not even necessarily, depending on the market, not even necessarily having a place there, but just really knowing an area well enough. And a lot of the times it's those foreigner areas where you know where to go, you know what to do, you know the things going on, you know the people. And so really just having a small community in certain areas.
Yeah. Very cool. Yeah, very, very cool. It's such a unique life that you're living right now. And are you seeing, is your business growing rapidly right now? Like with this whole movement, like is it really exploding compared to maybe what it was? Actually, no, ever since COVID, you would have like you opened the business at the perfect time. Like, are you seeing an increase? Like, what are you seeing from like a 30,000 foot view?
Yes, a lot. I mean, probably I'm a bit biased because I am Canadian, but a lot of Canadians and Americans, quite honestly, looking to leave a lot of the time is full time, just looking to get out. A lot of them are looking to become contractors for the companies that they work for. And of course, that's a conversation you have to have with your company so that you can then have your own company, get paid through your own company, and then optimize that for taxes as well. But yeah, I mean, especially a few days ago when certain things happened with the elections, like just woke up to a bunch of emails from clients like, I'm ready to leave, I'm ready to get out, let's hop on a call, like let's do this. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting time in the world. And I think in the last, I mean, it's hard for me to say because I'm so in this world, but I think from an outsider looking in, I would think the last like year and a half, I think it's become prevalent to a lot more individuals who are even just living in Canada or America that they need some sort of even backup option if they're not going to relocate themselves, their families, their lives. You need some sort of backup option. I mean, Mexico can be a great option to get a residency and just have it in your back pocket and really not spend any time in the country. But I don't know, I guess I could ask you that because you're not in this industry of investment
Yeah.
migration, but I feel like it's becoming more prevalent for the ordinary individual to understand that this is important.
Yeah, like it just having options, especially affordability. Like if you want to own a home in where I live in Vancouver, you need to have about so the average house is over $1 million. So when I think they just changed the law recently, but under $1 million, you could have 5% down. Over $1 million, you have to have 20% down. So they've changed it now to 1.5, which is good. But still, a house that's 1.5, most people don't have, what, 75 grand, because the average person doesn't make that much money. But if you want to own a home, it's like you need 20% down, like an actual house, not a tiny little condo. So people are looking at ways to, okay, if I want to buy a house or buy real estate, like like how much is a house in Paraguay, for example? Like a 3 by 2, 3 bedroom, 2 bathroom, like a normal house, not crazy fancy. How much is something like that there?
So I will say, like, there's a lot of variables that go into it,
Oh, for
right? And if
sure.
you're looking in the city, in the capital, Asuncion, there's some beautiful areas. They could be 300 or 400,000,
Oh,
but most people, most of them aren't for sale, quite honestly. We haven't really seen too many on the market. A lot of locals just live in the houses and those are their family homes, beautiful homes. You can go outside of the city a little bit. You're not in like the beautiful kind of Via Mora, if you know the Asuncion area where all the foreigners are, like you're not in that area. Maybe you're a 10-15 minute drive. And there can be homes, and a lot of them have some sort of land. You can also buy farms around 300,000-400,000 USD for an entire farm. A home could easily be 100 to 200. And then a lot of apartments in the city in Asuncion. I mean, there's mass construction of apartments, and that's a whole other conversation. But pre-build, you can even get in at around 75,000 US. And the whole market's in US for purchasing. And then it'll go up to maybe 120 for a studio, one bedroom, once it's built.
wow. Yeah, like are you talking like a 600 square foot apartment or 1,000 square foot apartment? Like how big is like somebody that's like 75 grand, like roughly? Is it tiny or is it actually okay?
It's a studio, so probably about 40.
Yeah. Still, like compared to here, it's 10% of the cost. Like literally 10%, which is crazy. Yeah, like even for rent for people, like what are people paying for rent in places like Argentina, Peru, like when they're moving there and nice and like what are they roughly on average? What would you say?
So I'll continue with the Paraguay market
Yep.
because not to confuse listeners, because every market is different,
Oh, for
especially when we go
sure.
to Argentina. But so in Paraguay, in the capital, in Asuncion, what we were just talking about for purchasing, it can, okay, it's going to be wild. It can vary quite drastically. So if you're living, this is not for foreigners, but just to give context, if you're living a local life and the locals make about 350 to 400 USD, and that's minimum wage here.
A month?
So a month.
Oh, wow.
So you and families, I mean, not a great life, but you can live on that. And so if you're looking at a not great area, still in the city, but not going to be the best area, no foreigners around, you can get it for $150. And that's just the reality. And that's in the capital city. If we're going outside the city, it can be a bit less. If you're going to be but no foreigner wants to live that lifestyle. If you're living in a nice area where the foreigners are safer, you can walk at night, you feel okay walking around late at night, you're probably going to be looking at around, I'd say 450 minimum and some foreigners do get surprised by it, can go up to about 900 to 1,000 USD per month. But I will caveat that with, I'd say the average is about 800, 850 per month, US. And all of these buildings have pools because it gets like 45 degrees, 100% humidity here in December, January. So they all have pools with hot water in that time of year. But they do have pools. A lot of them will have like a very basic gym. Maybe they'll have like a sauna or something like that. So they do have some sort of amenities, and they're usually new builds and they're nice buildings. So it's something, they'll have a barbecue as well. It's something that a foreigner would expect to live in and would have a good quality of life. But you can get $500, $600, but it will probably be not as new and not have all of those amenities.
Yeah, that's still so cheap. So cheap. Like crazy. Is it, I always wonder this, like people that want to do short-term things, is there like can people rent out short-term things like that in these places or do they have to do long-term?
Short term is tricky, quite honestly, especially if you don't have a cosigner somewhere like Paraguay. It can be tricky even for a long term rental, like a 12-month rental. You have to pay 2 months deposit. So usually we just recommend Airbnb. Airbnb is probably like almost 50% more, almost.
I
It's quite a
bet.
bit more if
Yeah.
you're looking to get Airbnb, but it's still quite affordable for a month. It could be less than 1,000 easily on Airbnb, having all the amenities. And yeah, it's just kind of a trade-off if you're looking for 1 to 2 months. If you're looking for, it's typically 12 months, but if you're looking for 6 months, like there's some contracts that can be found, but 12 months plus, no problem.
Yeah, easy. Crazy. Yeah, it's literally like, are most people working locally or are most people like doing things online? Are they adding things to the economy locally in these places or yeah, online work most people are doing?
Well, they are adding to the economy because they're
Oh,
spending
for
money
sure.
here.
That's what I'm thinking, but I'm talking
Um,
like job wise.
No, no, they definitely are not. And I mean, also the minimum wage, not that you would make minimum wage, but it's so low. If you really want to make even double minimum wage, like you're making $800 US dollars, you probably can maybe just pay your rent with that in a nice area. So no, absolutely every foreigner here is working online. A lot of them have companies incorporated elsewhere, or they're just passing through, and Paraguay is, a place that they come back to once every year.
Cool. Cool. Yeah. So interesting just to imagine what people are doing and yeah. Yeah, what is something that this is kind of a weird, I don't know how to ask this question, but what are some really interesting things that are on in your awareness right now that might sound crazy or to people who are like me who are not in your industry at all? Like anything that you're really excited about or anything that is just interesting that is really obvious to you, but when you share it with other people outside of what you do, they're like, really? Like, wow, an interesting
So,
question. Yeah, like
yeah, that's a
what
good
is
question.
something that is like so you've been working in this field for a long time, but when you share it with other people outside of it, they're like shocked or they're surprised or
I feel like, I mean, the first thing that pops to mind is kind of everything that we've discussed in this conversation, because I do think that a lot of people, and I hope that this really expands some of your listeners' views as well and gets them to critically think about some things. But I think a lot of people, if you're not in this space, and maybe that's why you invited me on as well, because I know you were like, I want to talk about this, don't realize that having Okay, a few things. Optimizing your tax and getting your tax to 0 to 10% is possible, but a lot of the time you have to leave a country like Canada or leave US, different story, but like leave your high taxing country. So I think a lot of people don't realize that it can be a reality for them. And then also to geo arbitrage, which just means that you're making money in a strong currency, US dollars, and then you're spending it somewhere like Paraguay, like Guatemala, like Peru. So you're really optimizing that difference.
Mm,
But I think a lot of people also don't realize that it's completely legal to have not only multiple passports, I feel like a lot of people know that, but it's legal to have multiple residencies. It's really just where you have your tax residency that what is what matters at the end of the day. And that's where leaving somewhere like Canada, you're going to give up your tax residency. And yes, it's a whole process, lots of filing involved, depending on your case. But you are able to have 8, 9, 10 different, not tax residencies, but residencies in and of themselves. And the way that I kind of like to differentiate between residency and a citizenship is that residency gives you almost all the same rights as a citizenship, except with the citizenship, you have access to getting a passport, which is what most people want. And then you also have access to voting and to serving in the country's military, which most people are not too worried about. So really the big difference like is the passport, the travel document. But with a residency, you can still live in the country. You're not on a tourist visa. You can live there for one day or you can live there for every day for the rest of your life. They are not going to kick you out. Whether you're a temporary resident or a permanent resident, you are still a resident.
very interesting. Yeah, I know I'm a permanent resident, right? So I'm not even a citizen of Canada. I'm a permanent resident of Canada. So I'm thinking about getting my citizenship so I can have two passports. I've been here long enough. It's just a nightmare to do it. And I can imagine in some of these other countries, it's probably a lot easier process. I can imagine some of these smaller countries because maybe it's easier, maybe it's not, but it's not as expensive. All the documents on the Canadian website are absolutely atrocious. They've left the last 10 years of different documents on the internet. I don't know if you knew that. But yeah. Yeah, it's so fascinating. Like geo arbitrage, that's such an interesting concept because a lot of people are talking about how to get their dollar to last further so you can get more purchasing power and also taxes. That's fascinating to me because I pay a lot of money in taxes. I don't mind paying taxes, but it's just like if you make decent money, especially in BC, it's a lot. It's a lot of like, do you know people that stay in their countries? Like, say you wanted to stay in Canada and you can get a resident somewhere else and you can like basically what they don't like, offshore tax accounts, like the Cayman Island, the Swiss bank account kind of stuff that people do. Like, do people do that to try to save on taxes? Do people contact you about that? Or is it mostly just moving to new countries and locating?
So once you reach a certain level of net worth, which is usually like 5 to 10 million, then you're probably not going to want to stay somewhere like Canada. It doesn't matter how good your lifestyle is, you're paying so much in taxes, and you can have a much, and I truly mean a much better lifestyle than whatever you're living in Canada with that money in somewhere else for less than half of the cost. Yes, it is a reality that you can have, and it's offshore accounts, yes, but there's more structure behind it of where is the business incorporated, where is the banking, where is the investment. So it's not just like a account one and done. So there is a lot more planning that goes into it, but I feel like that's something that's very glamorized in the movies.
Oh yeah.
And the reality is that, with blacklists and gray lists, and a lot of these countries have been kind of vilified into having to offer less services or really just market their services less. So it is a reality once you hit a certain net worth, but it's a structure that you're probably going to have in place with your trust in Panama and your company in Europe. And it's a multi-tiered structure. And quite honestly, a lot of these Caribbean island countries, I mean, they're great on paper. And yes, there are pretty high annual costs. You're probably looking at 50 to 100K to like keep these active. So your net worth really has to be substantial. But banking alone is also difficulty. Let's say you have a company in the Cayman. Okay, that's great, but every transaction that goes through your bank account, especially in the beginning, you're going to be subject to AML. So they're going to want to know, like, where is this money coming from? Who, sometimes even where is the money coming from? And then where is that money coming from? Right. So there's multiple levels of it for really understanding AML is anti-money laundering, like knowing where this money is coming from to come into these kind of like tax haven jurisdictions. So yes, we do help some clients structure that, but for most individuals, and even, when you're at the 1 to 3 million level, doesn't always make sense to pay 50 to 100K to keep your company and your banking active somewhere like Cayman Islands or BBI. I mean, structures in Latin America, in Europe, and even in Asia, places like Hong Kong and Singapore can work just as well and are much less headache.
Interesting. Yeah, I like what you said about glamorizing. There's a lot of glamorizing about having an offshore bank account and saying on taxes, like you could just call somebody and open up an account and all of a sudden you don't pay taxes. It doesn't work like that. Yeah.
It does not work like that at all. And I will say as well, like, I think the term offshore bank account kind of gets a bad rap because
Oh,
I
sure.
have, I don't know, 20 offshore bank accounts. They're just overseas bank accounts. Like, I bank, I mean, of course, I have core hubs, but I have so many bank accounts that I have to have a list to keep track of them. I think I have like 20 different apps on my phone. And I like the diversification of having banking in different jurisdictions around the world and no government, no country having access to all of my investments, to all of my funds. But those are all, I mean, technically considered offshore accounts. But some of them are quite easy to open. Some of them you have to have residency to open. Some of them it's a more rigorous process to open. But they're all offshore accounts at the end of the day. And it really is, I think, kind of destigmatizing that, like, I think it was very maybe like 80s or 90s movies where it was like, oh, I have an offshore account and I'm going to go to Colombia and like, drop off the drugs. And it's just not the reality anymore, especially, like I said, especially with the EU specifically coming out with their blacklist, their gray list, and just making banking so much more difficult. You have to be strategic about where you're banking, but it's very much so a reality.
What is something you want somebody to know that's thinking about it? Maybe some words of encouragement. We kind of wrap it up here and then we can then like figure out where people can get a hold of you, things like that. But yeah, what's something that maybe just some words of encouragement or just some entry level things that people need to know if they're thinking about doing that?
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, the first piece of what we were talking about earlier, which I like to call lifestyle design, for me is really figuring out what you want your short, medium, and long-term life to look like. And that literally is just thinking, writing it out,
Yeah.
thinking about it, but let it take a few weeks, maybe a few months, maybe it'll take a year, like let it take time to actually figure out what do you actually want out of life. But that's not enough because then the next step is you actually have to go and take action on that. And that is just as important as critically thinking about what you want out of life. You have to know where to go know and know how to start taking action on that. So that piece is really what we help clients on. But I think if anybody's listening and if these are new concepts to you, like listen again, head to our YouTube channel. I mean, we have so much content on YouTube talking about these programs and country options and where it could be best, where it could be worst, right? And so it's really figuring out not only from the lifestyle perspective what you like, what region of the world, what countries, where you want to be, city, beach, mountains, but also where can you, if it's important to you, have some tax advantages as well, because definitely not every country offers that, but it depends. Again, maybe the lifestyle is what's most important to you, and you're happy to pay 50% in tax, and like if that's the case, then I'm happy for you as long as you are happy with that decision.
Hmm. Yeah, like the designing your life. I think most people can do that. They'll be like, yeah, I want to work in the morning and then I want to go to the beach or I want to go to the mountain in the afternoon or whatever. But the next step is where the rubber hits the road. And it sounds like that's where you can really step in and help people with what you and your company does. What is the YouTube channel, by the way? What's the YouTube channel called that people can go check out?
Yeah, so we actually just did a rebrand and everything now is called Worldwise Capital. So on YouTube, on Instagram, we have a podcast, which is Worldwise Wealth, talking to a lot of entrepreneurs and talking a lot about everything we've discussed here in more detail. But for the most part, everything is Worldwise Capital. But if you're really interested in these concepts, I would say YouTube is a good place to start on our channel and just to get familiar with some of the options that could potentially be available to you. And if you are American, I mean, there are still options for you. Yes, it's much more difficult and a very serious decision to get out of the American system officially and don't become a covered expatriate, but you do still have options before you're looking to just completely renounce your citizenship.
Do you have to renounce your citizenship as a US citizen if you want to leave? Is that how it works?
If you want to be out of their tax net, yes, you
Oh,
do. I
wow.
mean, there are ways that you can optimize your taxes, but you're probably never going to get it to zero. And then also, depending on how your company is structured, your company could also potentially be liable to continue paying taxes in the US until you change your company and then also give up your citizenship.
Wow. So much to ponder, so much to think about. And any person that's listening to this, highly recommend, like you can see how meticulous she is with her communication, everything that all the way she's structured everything. You can tell that she's an absolute professional. And I know that you're probably going to help tens of thousands of more people. And I see myself probably booking a call with you at some point in the future, don't know when, but it's really nice knowing you and having you as a resource and having you as a connection because I know I'll be like, hey, talk to Nicole. Like I literally have your connection. I know I'm going to refer people to you. I have people talk about it. I'll be sitting at the jiu-jitsu gym I go to and people are like, oh man, I'm thinking about moving to Mexico. I want to move to Costa Rica. And it's cool that I can refer somebody to you because a lot of people get a lot lost. They get really lost. They do the step one you're talking about, but step two is like so much. Like, where do I start? And having somebody like you actually to help step by step on that journey, really cool. Like you got lawyers, you've got all kinds of stuff, like entire teams. You said in 20 different countries. Wow.
Yeah, 20 plus different countries. But like I said, a lot of the work we do is in Latin America just because we see such a big trend in clients really wanting to get in on Latin America now, like I was saying before the programs start to change, and they will.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us and sharing all this information. It's helped me dream a little bit bigger about my life and what my life could potentially look like. And yeah, I really appreciate it. And go follow her, Worldwise Capital, YouTube, Instagram, Worldwise Wealth Podcast. Go follow that. Go listen to that. If you are interested in that, click the link in her Instagram, book a call with her. Like, if you're dead serious, I know that you've probably helped. How many people do you think you've helped? Roughly. Thousands?
Okay. Not thousands,
Not yet.
probably hundreds. Yeah, definitely hundreds. 400, 500. Yeah,
Wow.
and it looks different. It's a strategy that's very unique to each individual. So sometimes it's a simple one or two residencies. Sometimes it's a complete overhaul in tax planning. It just depends on what you're needing.
Cool. Well, go follow her. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you all next week, people.